Hi, I'm Ali Pitts, and welcome to a Russian and Soviet movie podcast. And if you're listening to this on the day of release, Wednesday, 23rd of April 2025, Happy World Shakespeare Day. Do you have a favourite work by the bard? I do, but I feel a wee bit self-conscious admitting what it is. And that's because it's Hamlet. My pretentious, self-regarding street, which on a bad day is several miles wide, wishes it wasn't such an obvious pick, that it was a deeper cut that would make me sound cool and mysterious. On the other hand, I've heard so many people say that they had an extremely boring time learning Shakespeare at school, to the point that it's put them off for life, and I'm extremely grateful that my experience was the complete opposite of that. In large part due to having excellent English literature teachers at secondary school, particularly during my GCSEs, and because Hamlet really clicked with my gloomy, introspective teenage self. If you heard my track-by-track podcast on REM with frequent guest on this show, Lynn Serran, you'll know that I semi-jokingly self-identify as a stealth goth. I'm certain that Hamlet was largely to blame for my tendency to wear pretty much exclusively black clothing for about 5 years straight. Then there's Withnail and I. I'd first encountered Richard E. Grant in a series of adaptations of the Scarlet Pimpernel books in the late 90s and early 2000s, where he plays the character as a French Revolutionary era James Bond. And so when I found out that he was in this British cult film from the late 80s, a couple of sequences of which were shot in Stony Stratford, the town where I grew up, I was always going to check that film out. I did, I loved it, and it's one of my all-time favourites to this day. A number of years ago, I recorded an episode of the podcast Flixwise Canada on it with previous guest on this show, Martin Kessler. If you've never seen it before, Richard E. Grant's Withnail gives a blistering rendition of one of Hamlet's monologues, which I'm going to play you right here.
I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth. And indeed, it goes so heavily with my disposition, that this goodly frame the earth seems to me a sterile promontory.
It's the most excellent canopy, the air. Look you, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this majestical roof fretted with golden fire. Why, it appeareth nothing to me but a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours. What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god! The beauty of the world, paragon of animals. Yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me. No, nor women neither. No women neither.
Isn't that something? Incidentally, while we're sort of on the subject of what I like to call the other Stratford, Stoney gets the briefest of mentions in Shakespeare's Richard III, but alas poor Yorick, that bit usually gets cut for time. For the benefit of my fellow history nerds, I've included a link to the episode of Under the Grid, Milton Keynes Museum's podcast on Stony Stratford in the show notes. And then there's Denmark. Back when the UK was an EU member state, I got to participate in the Erasmus exchange programme, which took me to the University of Copenhagen. And I had an absolute blast in those 3 months in the Baltic. During that time, my folks paid me a visit, and we took a day trip to Elsinore itself, or to give it its non-anglicised name, Helsinore. I'll be posting a couple of old photos from that time on my Instagram feed if you're interested. I think it was also around this time that a friend introduced me to Tom Stoppard's film version of his own play Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, starring Gary Oldman and Tim Roth, which I also absolutely loved. To quote another beloved film of mine, Clueless, it's way existential. So, to summarise, brevity being the soul of wit, ha ha ha. My Shakespeare tastes may be pretty basic, but I have my reasons. Okay, so at this point you'd be excused for wondering what any of this has to do with the ostensible theme of this show, namely Russian and/or Soviet movie stuff. Well, this is where Boris Pasternak comes in. In the West, he's famous for the novel Dr. Zhivago, which British director David Lean and his cast and crew turned into one of the biggest blockbusters of all time. A little while back, I contributed some background notes on Pasternak to an episode of the war movie podcast Danger Close, which discussed that famous adaptation. I'm planning on releasing that episode on this feed in the not too distant future, but if you don't feel like waiting that vague and unspecified amount of time, I've linked the Danger Close website in the show notes. By the way, if you're listening to this from the UK and you're in possession of a TV licence, the film seems to turn up on BBC iPlayer with surprising frequency. It's one of those epic movies that's well suited to a rainy Sunday afternoon, or indeed a characteristically damp bank holiday Monday, as is the case on the day I'm recording this.
With a foul and pestilent congregation of vapours.
Alright, back to Pasternak himself. In Russia and among the global Russophone diaspora, he's remembered first and foremost as a poet. Some of his work is used in the melancholic New Year rom-com Irony of Fate or Enjoy Your Bath, which we covered very early on in this show. He's also revered as a translator. I discovered this early on in my days as an English language teacher in Russia at the very end of the 2000s. I was browsing through the bookshelves at one of the language schools I taught at in a southwestern suburb of Moscow, imaginatively named Yugo-Zapadnaya, literally southwest, when I happened upon a copy of Pasternak's translation of some of Shakespeare's works. I have no recollection of exactly what it contained, only that it sparked my curiosity. In fact, it's his translations that were used in several Soviet film adaptations of Shakespeare's plays across the 1950s, 60s and 70s, including a version of Hamlet starring Innokenty Smoktunovsky as the melancholy Dane. Smoktunovsky was also in Letter Never Sent, which we've covered previously on this podcast. That film's Ophelia was played by Anastasia Vertinskaya, and you can see her in the delightfully silly but still rather moving The Amphibian Man, which I discussed on the projection booth, and you can find that episode on this feed as well. So all this personal history and convergence of a whole bunch of my special interests means that you could say I was well primed to be into Grand Theft Hamlet. In case it's passed you by, it's directed by Pinny, Grylls and Sam Crane, and it won the Grand Jury Award at South by Southwest for Best Documentary Feature in 2024. Like Withnail and I, its protagonists are two out-of-work actors. Unlike Withnail and I, they never share physical space on screen. That's because the whole film takes place inside the video game Grand Theft Auto. The two friends are using the game to hang out virtually as this is all taking place during the COVID-19 pandemic. They stumble upon an outdoor amphitheatre and give a few lines of the Sound and Fury speech from Macbeth a whirl, and this sparks the idea of staging one of Shakespeare's plays in-game. That's all the details I'll give by way of setup. I'll just say that I found it extremely entertaining but also moving and cathartic. The film touches on subjects of mental health, creating art, and the frustration that comes with pouring a whole lot of energy into making something and then feeling like it's being met by a wall of indifference, which neatly mirrors the feelings of futility that Hamlet expresses throughout the play. If that's of interest, it's playing on the streaming service Mubi, and if you go to mubi.com/Russian Soviet Pod, you can get a 30-day free trial. I also have a list of Mubi recommendations on Letterboxd that I update pretty frequently. The Mubi podcast also has an episode discussing the film and other on-screen depictions of Hamlet that is well worth a listen. As ever, links can be found in the show notes. And one final digression/coda before Flights of Angels sing this episode to its rest. One of the great poets of Russian and Soviet cinema, Andrei Tarkovsky, and his connection with Hamlet. I'm reading Tarkovsky's diaries at the moment, which were translated by Kitty Hunter Blair and published as Time Within Time. The end of that volume contains Tarkovsky's plans and notes for his stage version of Hamlet. Incidentally, he calls Pasternak a great poet, but describes his translation of Hamlet as, quote, staggeringly inaccurate, end quote. Here's another thought of his that particularly grabbed me. Quote, I dare say that Hamlet is the one play in world literature which has not been solved, and it is eternal, end quote. Given some of his thematic preoccupations and indeed his own tragic biography, it's entirely unsurprising that he was drawn to this material. At the time of recording, you can find Tarkovsky's final film, The Sacrifice, on Mubi as well, at least if you're in the UK or Ireland. I'm not sure about elsewhere. To head back to the Baltic and my personal connection with Hamlet-related media, the outro music for this episode is a snippet from Ophelia by Danish band Kashmir that my way cooler than me brother Matt introduced to me about 2 decades ago. Das Vidania, folks, and indeed, farvel.
Ophelia.